Yeah, my name is Jerry Balcom. I've been with the Bonneville Power Administration since about late February of this year. I came to the Bonneville Power Administration from another little organization called the Army Corps of Engineers, where I spent 40 years working as a safety manager, safety specialist at the district division and even at headquarters level. So I love to get what I do. I love to do what I get to do, which is safety and occupational health. And I'm really thankful, number one, that y'all are here, because it is our intent over the next few hours to kind of lay out the major changes that took place with this C-Sharps document. One of the first things my boss handed to me when I came on board and met Alan Connors was to look at this whole, contractor safety and health requirements for primes and subs, and to see if it had any need for improvements or changes. And we did. We made some major changes. A lot of them were kind of cart before the horse type issues. We had several different sections in the old manual that would refer to the same thing. For example, we would have sections that referred to equipment and rigging, and you'd find it scattered throughout the old document. So what we tried to do for consistency's sake is bring some of those things into alignment, kind of bring them back together, make it make sense, try to put it in a more logical order. In other words, I wouldn't go out and talk about minimum approach distances before I'd actually started talking about, some of the precursors for identifying or verifying, whether or not we had energy. So we just tried to do a little bit of alignment. So, safety took the lead, as Rachel said, and, Alan and I were kind of the co-PMs for rewriting this. But all through this whole process, we had procurement involved. We had really outstanding support from transmission and aerial services, vegetation management, and of course, contracting. So a really good team effort. We passed this back and forth until we felt like we really had a good document. Around the September timeframe, though, we had some significant impacted accident-related type events that took place within the Bonneville Power Administration. Those type of events that really caused us to stop and take a look at some of the language you used. Was there a need to clarify? And we will talk about some of the clarifications that we made. But specifically, I want to highlight two areas that we did touch on. One was just the whole notification process with respects to accidents, mishaps, things like that. Y'all working in the contracting world understand what OSHA requires you to do with respects to notification. Bonneville Power just needed to make sure that we were consistent with that, and that if we had any additional requirements that we were seeking, that we would also make those available to you as far as information purposes go. The other thing that we really took a hard look at related to one of the accidents was the need to identify or clean up a little bit of our equipment operations, our load handling equipment operations, to be more specific. And, the importance of that team coming together to identify lifting practices, processes, and procedures. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but those are two of the last things that we just touched on with this document. Other than that, Rachel provided you with the guidance as far as when this all takes in effect. So Rachel, next slide. Okay, so for the purposes of this discussion, we want to make sure you all understand that we have those general requirements that are identified in Chapter 1. I mean, everyone that works under the BPI or the BPI 1512 and 1513, as you're developing a safety plan, you will see that these general requirements universally apply to everyone out there. Chapter 2 we'll talk about work and stub stations and related BPA facilities with respects to the qualifications and things like that. Chapter 3 does the same thing, only as it relates to the BPA right-of-ways and towers. And then Chapter 4 talks about commercial aviation services and non-transportation, did a little bit of cleanup there. And the same thing with vegetation management. So those are the chapters of C-Sharps. Now, Rachel, if you'll click over to the next slide, folks, this is where we start, buckle up your seatbelts, if you will, because we're going to start talking about the changes in the document. And, I'm looking at the screen as I'm talking. I don't see any chat yet. I don't see any questions yet. So I'm going to assume that as an overview, you all understand, you're all tracking. And so Rachel, go ahead and go to the next slide.
Are you guys not seeing section 1.2?
There we go. Now I'm good. Okay, so here we go. This is where we start to get into the meat and potatoes of what we did. And what I did as far as format goes is you'll see in the slide above, what the old section used to talk about, and then what the new document attempts to identify. And so as you can see here, it talks about the fact that the employee shall comply with, and with respect to their responsibilities and their requirements. It kind of broke it out and gave a little bit more verbiage to that. But I want to emphasize one thing to you. But go back to that slide, Rachel, 1.1. I want to emphasize one thing that's really important. If you are a contractor or if you are a Bonneville Power employee and you are working with this document on a daily basis, I really highly encourage you to read the document. Maybe just not those sections that you want to go look in. Maybe I'm looking for bonding and grounding. But take a look at the entirety of the document. And if you don't hear me say anything else today, hear me say this. You need to read the document. You need to go through it and look how it blends and works together. Is it perfect? No, because human hands touched it. But we have made every effort to try to clean this document up and make it more user-friendly to you and to our organization. I want to give you this little analogy. When I was with the Army Corps of Engineers, I used to work on our load handling equipment program. Well, one of the key things I got to do when I was working for the Corps, we went out to several districts in the Corps and just assessed, cranes and rigging operation. And I walked up to a crane operator one day, had a brand spanking new crane, and on that crane he had a man basket hooked to it. And so I walked up to him, I introduced myself. Hi, my name's Jerry Balcom, headquarters Corps of Engineers. I'm just wanting to ask you if this crane is rated to be used in that configuration with the man basket on the front. He goes, well, I've been using this crane for the last 5 days doing it. I said, well, that's really good. I appreciate that. I've been using cranes, Mr. Balcom, for the last 20 years. I know what needs to happen with respect to man baskets. Very good. I'm not trying to be confrontational. I'm just trying to get the answer. Is this crane, does the manufacturer allow you to use this crane this way? He goes, I don't know, where would you look? And I said, well, I look in the owner's manual. He says, okay, well, I think that's right here behind me. So he pulled out the owner's manual. He handed it to me. And I looked, and folks, it took me 5 pages to find where it said, this crane shall not be used for lifting and hoisting of personnel. Stop. And so I asked him, I said, have you read this manual? And he goes, nah, I never read those things. I said, well, had you read this one, you would have recognized that you cannot use that crane for the purposes that you have it right now. He goes, you mean I can't haul, basically can't haul Jeff and Jerry and put them in a basket and put them over the side into the navigation lock? And I said, not this crane. And so that ruined his day. What's the point? Read the manual. The manual provides you with the instructions and the guidance that we want you all to be aware of, and then to be able to use for the situations that you find yourself working with as you engage in contract with the Bonneville Power Administration. So, Rachel, I think that's enough for that. Do you have any questions on that, anybody? Okay. Another very important section in this document has to do with stop work. I think we would all on the phone recognize the fact that, as an employee, you as supervisors, employees work together. We plan our work and then we work that plan. But when there are situations or conditions that can arise during the course of our daily operations where we do not feel that work practice or that work task is safe, or it poses a danger that could reasonably be expected to cause severe injury or death to anyone in my operations, I as an employee have the right to stop work. And we take that very seriously here at Bonneville Power, and we just want to make sure that you all understand what this section is saying with respect to identifying the rights of an employee to decline to perform a task if they believe it's unsafe to do so. And then we have processes, obviously, that we can work through that to figure out how can we go back to work safely. And that's the bottom line word, safely. Okay? So that was the major change. We just kind of beefed up. There is a stop work policy that BPA has. So we kind of aligned the language in that stop work policy with the general requirements that are identified here in section 1.2. Any questions on that? Okay, next slide, Rachel. All right, chapter 2. One of the things that we changed here is just the language. We used to call, and we won't be calling it into the future, a site-specific safety plan. In the future, what we're asking all contractors, even our own employees, to recognize is that we have a safety plan requirement. And it's a risk-based approach, for contractors that provide submittals to us, and we base it on risk. And so that if I'm a janitorial contract, maybe I'm going into a facility, and my whole purpose in life is just to do janitorial work. Do I need to have this long, full, encompassing safety plan? Well, for those types of activities, we would probably tell you no. And there's an abbreviated safety plan that you can use to identify the hazards and risks, how you will control and mitigate those risks in that environment. Now, however, if you're going to bring new transformers into my substations, where we're working with grounding grids and overhead utilities and all sorts of other high-risk activities, those will require contractors to submit to us what we would call the full-blown safety plan. And that covers everything from asbestos to xylene, if you will, A to Z, well, A to X, actually. And we would ask you to look at all those things that might be in that work environment. That requires you as a contractor to work with our folks in BPA to look at the drawings, make sure that I've got access to the facility. I need to know where my grounding grid is so I don't trample all over it. I need to make sure that my overhead hazards have been identified. If I'm going to be digging, I need to make sure my excavation plans are properly addressed. My confined space programs are properly addressed. I think you understand what I'm saying is that based on the risk, based on the hazards of the work that you will be performing for BPA, we kind of look at that internally and you make a determination with respect to, do I need the abbreviated plan or do I need the full-blown safety plan that covers everything from soup to nuts? So, again, we will look at this and we will be working internally with you folks to make sure we get this right. We're not trying to ask you if you're a janitorial contractor to send me everything because you're not doing excavation, you're not doing trenching. You shouldn't be doing confined space entry for that matter. But we will look at these risk-based, if you will, based on risk, I should say, and that will allow us to, make sure we provide the right guidance back to you as a contractor, and that we get the information that we need to safely execute the task or the work. Any question on that? Okay, as Rachel noted to you earlier, as you can see on this bpa.gov website, we have provided you with safety plan templates, both the long version and the abbreviated version of those documents. And then as we will talk here in a little bit about the critical lift plan template. But there it is as far as where can I go to get this information? And so that's available to you, and we will keep that updated. If critical lift plans or any of these documents change into the future, this would be a good place to go back to see if I need to look at a different way of doing things. So Rob Smith has a question. If there are multiple sites in a work effort, will the plan be for all sites or general sections and specific issues with each site? So I'm going to let the contractors of the contracting of the world answer that question. I think I have an answer, but I'll let contracting go first. I'll mute my phone.
Jerry, I assume you're meaning procurement. I think it is supposed to cover all the sites in a particular contract. So it's not one for every site, it's one for the whole project. Jerry and Alan, correct me if I'm wrong.
So here's how I would interpret that. And we do this a few times in the BPA, and so we did it with the Corps. So if we have a roofing contractor, let's say, I'm just going to pick that subject. I may have a roofing contract issued to me, but in that roofing contract, it may be for multiple locations. I could be working on 5 different parts of the system, if you will, under one contract. What I would like to see is the contractor make sure that they just don't send me, number one, don't send me your corporate safety plan. We don't need that. We get that, but we don't need that. Under a safety plan, you would provide to us and identify the hazards because they could be unique in each one of those 5 different locations. Would you not agree? I could have a roof in some locations where I have a parapet wall that's meets the 42 inches in height, and I'm good. I could go on the roof next door to a different facility, and I've got a 24-inch high parapet wall that I've got to work with. Now I have to address the fall protection hazards issues. So in my mind, you have to look at the hazards at each one of those, let's say, 5 facilities under that contract. And if it needs to, it should address those unique hazards to each one of those sites. Alan, do you have something else you want to add?
A contractor could easily list out within that same, if they were to offer a single safety plan, they could put each of the site and specific requirements at each of those sites separately. As Jerry said, from the safety side, we would be evaluating that safety plan versus how the contractor has sufficiently planned safe work operations at each of those sites. And you could do that in one large encompassing safety plan. Most of our contractors find it a lot easier to separate those out, make site-specific adjustments to that. But as from the safety evaluation side, we're looking at whether or not they've got an adequate plan that covers the specificity at each site. But you could do that in one overarching plan. But it might even, in many cases, be easier just to submit multiple plans for each site.
You know, I've seen it when we've done this at the Corps of Engineers. If any of you have driven up and down the Columbia River, you would definitely agree with me that if I make this statement, it would be true. That if you've driven past Bonneville Dam, you see all the superstructure up on top of Powerhouse 1. Lattice and things hanging everywhere. You go 40 miles to the east to the Dalles Dam, the roof looks different. The transformers are in a different configuration. The deck makeup in and of itself is a totally different construct. If you go 25 miles up the river from there, John Day's is a totally different. And I would tell you that even the environmental impacts on each one of those roofs is unique and different. John Day, the roof is almost trying to be sucked up off of the powerhouse because the way the wind blows and the way the wind comes up over that parapet wall, it creates a negative lift and tries to suck that roof off. It doesn't do that at Bonneville. So to our point is that you just need to make sure you identify the specific hazards of those sites. You could do it in one contract. And like that, somebody says we typically use 385.11, which I'm a little bit familiar with, as a template. Is this allowed, or are we required to use the BPA template? I think, Amanda, as you look at 385.1 site-specific, what the Corps would call it is an accident prevention plan for everybody else on the phone. And so you will see, I think, Amanda, some real close similarities between what that looked like and what this looks like. Of course, we changed it enough to make it so we meet the Bonneville Power uniqueness. We are a different type of an organization than the Army Corps of Engineers is, but you'll see some similarities. But, just look at the two. I think you'll be able to easily adapt what you have been doing for the Corps of Engineers to what BPA is requesting following the template format. They look a little bit alike. Does that answer your question, I hope? You're welcome. Any other questions on this? Okay, Rachel. Rachel. It didn't change yet, Rachel, if you're tracking. I need to see slide number 11. I think. There we go. I'm going to do this one, and then I'm going to hand it off to Alan Connors for the next one. But one of the things we added to the C-Sharps document that wasn't there before was this whole waiver process. And I would say, to start off the discussion here, that this is the exception to the rule. Our plans, our specifications should be adequate enough that you should never need to invoke this. However, we find ourselves from time to time, there be maybe unique situations where we would come, you as a contractor would come to the Bonneville Power Administration and ask for a waiver on the contract safety requirements. And what you need to recognize that if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that as you're providing information back to us, that you are identifying a greater level of protection, that you would have a standalone job hazard analysis for the waiver condition. You would identify in the BPA C-Sharps document or in the specifications what you're seeking relief from or a waiver from. And then the Bonneville Power Administration, through a defined process, which you would read when you go to this section of the document, how we will review it, how we will evaluate it, the timeline of when all that happens, and how we will get back to you. And so again, this wasn't in there. We felt like we needed to provide that, but we don't think, to be perfectly honest, that, or at least we hope we don't see many waivers coming to us from contractors. We hope that our contract plans and specs and that our safety manual is clear enough that we don't need to exercise this. However, in those rare circumstances, we would evaluate those and make determinations if we could relieve some of those requirements. Now, just because it's relieved in your contract now doesn't mean that in all future contractors that would be waived. It would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and what we would do internally is we would look at the section that you were looking at and saying, we need relief from this or a change to it, because we look at this document every 6 months. If there are substantive changes to C-Sharps, we will make those again for your information on the phone here next April. So we would look to see if we had something that wasn't reading right. If a lot of contractors came to us and said, I'm having issues with this, then that would be an internal thing that we would maybe need to look at, the language. Maybe we weren't as clear as we could have been, needed to be. And so that's how we will address that. So again, it's there. Again, it's part of reading the manual to see how we would administer any waivers, changes to this document. Any questions on that? Okay, Rachel, if you'll switch sides, I'm going to mute my phone, and Alan, you're up.
Thanks, Jerry. So the next section we're going to go into is blasting. So in the blasting section, we haven't really made any significant changes within the C-Sharps document itself. The only real changes were on the BPA side, where our construction specification for blasting, we've made for the transmission group, we made a standard within BPA, so you might see more consistency within projects, but essentially no changes within the C-Sharps document. Any questions? Rachel, if you go to the next slide. So in regards to communications, section 5, we revised it from communications to emergency communications. The requirements that employees be provided with an effective means of emergency communications, cellular phone, two-way radios, or other acceptable means. Ensuring that the selected method of communication will be readily available within immediate reach of the employees and be tested prior to the start of work to verify effective operation, especially as it relates to remote work areas. Some of our work areas do not have cell phone service, and we work in pretty remote areas, so that testing and make sure that the communication in case an emergency situation does arise during the project is up and functional, and you've got a good process for that is important. And employee check-in, check-out communication procedure we developed to ensure employee safety. By that, what we're referring to is having that process in place to ensure that employees working at remote sites, that you've got some sort of system in place for ensuring that the employee arrives safely and have left that work safely at the end of the day. Any questions?
I will add to that, Alan. One of the things that we also then just keep this in the back of the mind as we go through these slides, that these are all critical pieces of the safety plan that you are submitting as a contractor to the Bonneville Power Administration. Communications, emergency communications, as it now reads, we were looking for that type of detail. We will be looking, that's a box, if you will, things that we check when we go through the safety plan. That's all I wanted to add out.
Okay. Next slide, dear Rachel. So in regards to confined spaces, we've changed in Section 7, we've changed the title to Permit Required Confined Spaces, better alignment with the requirements found in OSHA, specifically the 1910-146. Placed emphasis on the contract requirements to evaluate and identify permit required confined spaces and address your plan as part of the safety plan submittal, so that we can review and ensure that you've got a safe approach to that particular work. We want to retain permits for 1 year to facilitate BPA review of the documentation. That's not a requirement. We definitely want to, as part of safety's review of that safety plan, we're going to be looking at what is your rescue process, your permit required confined space rescue plan as part of that site-specific or that safety plan element. Any questions there? The question is the use of the BPA mobile radio system as possible communication means. I do not know. Adam, do you know if any of our contractors use our radio system? I know some of our internal contractors do, but I'm not sure if the external contractors utilize our mobile radio system.
Well, I know they have in the past. I'm not sure what exactly the requirements of that are. If I'll actually have to read that section in the document as well. But that is an effective means. I'm going to say it's the only means. There is cell phone reception. If you don't have cell phone reception, then a radio is effective. Sometimes, depending on where you're at.
Thanks, Adam. The other question is, do we have to turn in the permit to BPA? There's no requirement for turning that permit into BPA, although as part of the contract, if there's an incident that occurs, we may request a copy of that permit, or as a matter of just reviewing how a project went, we may ask for it. So it is required under the contract, but under the C-sharps, but there's no automatic conveyance of that that permit to BPA.
So I would add to that, and I agree with what Alan said, is, when I come out to do a job observation, and I know, having looked at the scope of the work and the contract that's there in front of me, if there is confined space work involved in that project, it's probably one of the things that during my job observation I would look for. I want to see how you guys are monitoring that. I can't emphasize enough what Alan said to you all with respect to emergency services, rescue operations. Don't assume, given some of the areas that we work in, that these fire districts, these have the ability to do rescue operations. We found out the hard way, working with the Corps, that you just couldn't pick up the phone and call 911 and expect any of the response teams in our areas to have that rescue capability. It's something you have to check out, verify, and ensure that they do or they don't. If they don't, then it's incumbent upon you as the contractor to identify how rescue will be performed. We don't want this to ever turn into a recovery operations. We want this to be a rescue plan that identifies all the key components of that in that safety plan you submit to us.
Thanks, Sherry. Next slide, Rachel. So this particular section, we've done some considerable changes to. It was the old 1.7. It's now Section 8. We've added more prescriptive language with respect to the process by which your workers will gain access to our energized facilities and communication sites. We've more clearly identified employer requirements for non-electrical worker, restricted electrical worker, or electrical worker permits. We provide better language that comes through the Rules of Conduct handbook, specifically as relates to escorting requirements. All of the contractor workers must obtain a non-electrical worker, restricted electrical worker, or electrical worker permit as applicable to their work for unescorted entry to BPA energized facilities and communication sites. Unpermitted workers will be escorted at all times as indicated in the Rules of Conduct Handbook. Whenever a worker enters energized facilities and communication sites, whenever work is otherwise in proximity to BPA's normally energized transmission facilities, you'll need to provide for the safety of workers and at all times take necessary precautions to protect your workers from accidental contact. At no time will any non-permitted worker or equipment come closer to energized lines or equipment than the minimum approach distance, MAD, that's listed in the minimum approach distance tables in section 25. Entry into, exit out of, and movement within those energized facilities or communication sites by non-permitted person requires an escort. Escorts must hold a permit that will allow them to perform the work by the person being escorted. For further information, you can look at the Rules of Conduct Handbook, Section 8.4, Escorting. We also put a requirement that no more than 5 unpermitted visitors are allowed for a single escort, so that we want to maintain at least a maximum of 5-to-1 ratio. At energized facilities with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, site, critical infrastructure protection or physical security perimeter at control centers. The contractor will need to discuss specifically in the site safety plan what safety is going to be looking at. The contractor to discuss the specific use of escorts as part of the safety plan. When are they required? When do you intend to use it? From our standpoint, we want to see that some thought is that you've got a structured plan for controlling the movement of those unpermitted persons within the project. Any questions?
I know it's seamless to everybody on the phone, but I would have to tell you, and there are others on this phone that are part of this group, we have done a great deal of work, my goodness, since I started probably in February, with this whole access to energized facilities. So as an agency, I would tell you that we have really scrubbed this hard to make sure that we have addressed it properly. And so, you know, I think you see the benefits of that here. We've tried to then make sure that the other language that goes along with the escorts and things like that are properly aligned. A lot of work went into this. And so, again, read the manual.
Alan, you're muted.
Thanks. I was muted. So the team felt that sequentially this section and the information contained within the section was out of sequence with the old document. So we did a lot of changes with this particular section. It defined part of it is defining common C-sharps terminology for qualified electrical employee, qualified electrical person to avoid confusion. The old document was inconsistent in addressing contractor employee versus BPA employee and the terminologies for both. So we did a lot of cleanup here to make it a little bit more understandable as contractors looked at both the C-sharps document and our Rules of Conduct Handbook to understand what those requirements were. Any questions on that? Or Adam, did you want to add a little bit more to that?
No, I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay. Next slide, Rachel. So in regards to utility locates, which is our section 10, we relocated that within the flow of the entire document to make it a little bit more easy, the document to be a little bit more easy to be used by our contractors. The language basically stayed the same. There wasn't really any significant change to that particular section. There's no questions. Could you go to the next slide, Rachel?
And before he does that, I want to highlight to everyone on the phone here the importance of that section, because over the last 5 days in this organization, we had a contractor who came in contact with about 7,000 volt line, and that could ruin your day, folks. So again, it's important to look at the drawings, to do the locates, to do all those things that we identify, not only in the C-sharp document, but within the specifications for underground utilities, things like that. We are overhead and underground all around you. So make sure that you're looking at the documents, your plans and your specifications, and then following the requirements with respect to locating, our clearances needed, questions like that. Make sure you're taking a look at this, folks. We just had a recent event.
Thanks, Jay. Next slide, Rachel. So in the grounding section, section 11, voltage testing. Voltage testing was a standalone section, and the information contained within was moved up in the new C-sharps document. So we changed the location to make it flow a little better. We provided some additional new language to ensure that contractors that you identified and tested for voltage prior to work, we provided language from our BPA work standard and referenced that work standard. In this case, we provided language from our BPA work standard, basically the BPA internal procedure documents, to give you a little bit more guidance on voltage testing. We clarified procedures to allow for the identification of any circuit being tested. We clarified the minimum crew size and provide additional clarity on installing and removing personal protective grounds. Any questions there?
For everybody on the phone, I want to make sure I understand this is kind of the first time we talk about, and as Alan identified, we point to a work standard. We identify what that work standard is by title, and then we tell you that if you have need of or information from that work standard, that it is available upon request. That's kind of new language in some respects to this document. We have internal documents that we use on a day-to-day basis. However, in this revision to the C-sharps document, we identified the work standard and said, if you need the information that you might find in that, it is available upon request. That's all I'd add, Alan.
Thanks, Jerry. Don't see any questions. So next slide, Rachel. Arc flash hazards. So we've provided a cleaner definition of arc flash protocols that you'll need to follow. We've clarified arc flash PPE requirements to make it more clear of what's required for entry within our facilities. Defines an electrically safe work condition. What do we mean by that? More cleaner definition. Discussed what to do when an unlabeled panel is discovered. We're listing that if you come across an unlabeled panel, we have certain specific steps and procedures that you need to take to make sure that we coordinate well in order to ensure that your contractors are working safely and you understand the hazards associated with that particular work. And we clarified what we mean by limited approach boundary and how BPA what are the minimum requirements that BPA is going to require there. Any questions on that?
Adam, I know you worked with this a little bit, and I think some of the changes that we made to this document came from you in this area. I know Adam, for everybody else, Adam can identify himself as for what he does for the Bonneville Power Administration, but anything you want to add here with respect to PPE and arc flash hazards?
Oh, thanks, Jerry. Alan. Yeah, we did do quite a bit of work in this area, clearing it up, just making it more easier to read, and also just moving things around a little bit, arranging it in a more logical manner, if you will. It's all there, and I do think we reference our internal documents to add in any help that they could be, and those will all be added in terms of a hyperlink, I think is how we're doing that, if I'm correct. And see, I saw a question come up about what about ARC-HR rating on the right-of-way? In what respect? For what kind of work? I guess I don't understand exactly the context there. If it's line work, then they have the ACAL rating, and if it's just equipment work out there, before I get too far on that, I've only dealt with the electrical hazards. So if you're doing electrical hazards, then you're going to have to comply with the 8 calorie rating.
Hey, Adam, this is Ryan. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah, okay. Hey, just to add on the whole arc flash deal, we took a lot of time to make sure our documents aligned with NFPA 70E, OSHA, to make it less confusing for contractors. We didn't want to give guidance in a BPA document that wasn't in line with OSHA, to where the contractor could say, well, BPA said we could do this. So there again, we took a lot of time to make sure our documents matched the guidance from OSHA and NFPA 70E. And as far as arc flash on the right of way, it's really only required for the line crews if they're doing hot work, grounding, ungrounding, anytime they're dealing with the energized circuit. If the circuit is not energized and it is grounded, then arc flash isn't an issue anymore, and just walking down the right of way, arc flash isn't an issue as well. Hopefully that answers the question.
There was an additional clarifier there, Ryan, on that question about right of way, which was line work for, say, installing fiber optic cables.
Yeah, Alan, I would say that if the circuit was still energized and you had a hold on it and you were pulling in, fiber optic down below and then raising it up at a later time, I would say that arc flash PPE would be required unless the circuit was de-energized.
Thanks, Ryan. I don't see any other questions. Rachel, if we could go to the next slide. So in regards to batteries and charges, section 13, we created a standalone section for capacitors. There's two different work tasks. So we were we relocate and revise the old 1.10. We've deleted the reference to capacitors. We felt it didn't fit within the framework of the subject heading. So we created a brand new section for capacitor work. We provided guidance per our BPA work standard, the same title, essentially taking in some of those procedural requirements that we have for our own internal workforce and adding it into the C-sharps. We provide additional safety measures the contractor will need to take to ensure the safety of working in this environment, atmospheric ventilation monitoring, for example. Any questions on that?
I think that was one of the, what we had come up against this spring now, and you guys remember that really weren't clear on what the requirements were inside, like battery storage rooms. And so we had contractors that were working in there. We were getting questions from the contractors as far as what do I need to do with respect to monitoring the space, ventilating the space. We really didn't talk about it in the C-sharp document. Obviously, you could go find out what OSHA says, but we kind of cleaned up that language. The other thing we did, as Alan noticed, we took capacitors out of there. When you think about batteries, chargers, capacitors, we needed to fill that out. So Alan's going to touch on that in the next slide as far as what we did with capacitors. But I just want to make sure that you all understood that we really did more on the environmental or the worker protection in this section than anything.
Thanks, Jerry. Don't see any questions. If we go to the next slide, over on capacitors.
Yep, there you go.
There we go. So as we mentioned in the previous slide, we broke up the capacitor section separately, created a standalone section for capacitors, and we provided a methodology that's listed in that on that slide for discharging capacitors. Adam, you want to add anything to that?
No, nothing to add. There wasn't a whole lot done there, but it speaks for itself.
Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, if we could go to the next slide. Rachel, if you could go to the next slide.
Can you see it now?
Yep, I can see it now. Thank you. So we didn't make any significant changes to this section on conductive devices. Minor cleaning up on language. Any questions there?
No questions there, Alan. It'd be good just to read the the current safety alert that came out in regards to using metal tapes, though.
Yeah, I don't have it handy, Ryan. Do you have it off the top of your head?
No, it's just the basic guidance was that if there could be a touch potential or a step potential, that metal tape should not be used. That was the gist of it.
I can add a little bit of dialogue there for you, Alan.
Yeah, please.
As Ryan mentioned, there was a interim tweak to guidance on using metal tapes for taking reference poles, or actually, reference point measurements in areas where step and touch or transfer touch potential hazards exist. I can certainly send that safety alert if it didn't get to the folks on this call. And this was this was done just recently in the last 2 weeks as a result of an incident we had on the right of way. So there's going to be some proposed changes probably to this language that we'll have to, if there's any interim guidance, we can provide that. But in terms of long-term guidance next April, I would expect this to look a little different when we go to review this again.
Yeah, it's good to note what our process is where it came up on providing those safety alerts to contractors and some contracts. As safety identifies some sort of an issue that comes up, maybe there's a near hit or some other type of incident or an injury, BPA has a team of professionals that go out, safety professionals along with crews and in conjunction with contractors, find out what happened, determine how we can prevent that type of a situation from happening again. And many times we'll issue a safety alert that says, hey, until we can actually change process and procedures, this is some or the C-Sharps document as we're reviewing here. Here's some interim guidance where there's a hazard that's been identified that we need to alert you of that it's a potential hazard. We distribute those sometimes through the ISN, pushing through ISN, and those safety alerts we do provide to our CORs to push out to contractors as well. If you haven't received those, please contact your COR. And with that, I'll go on. I don't see any additional questions. Jared Perez want to make sure that we let everyone know that for those contractors who subscribe to ISN, that safety alert notice was posted to the bulletin board. Next slide, Rachel.
All right, Ellen, it's 9:55. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Please be back at 10:05.
Sounds great.
All right, good morning, everyone. Let's get back to it. I don't remember if Jerry or Alan is presenting.
I think I did my 10, Jerry. Do you want to take it up, or you want me to continue?
Oh, okay. I got it. All right, folks. We are on slide 20. Well, I think we talked about conductive devices, right before the break. So I think, Rachel, we can move to the next slide, which is all about barriers and guards. There we go. So, significant, well, I would say not significant, but, some clarifications on barriers and guards. It was easy when you looked at the document the first time that you could confuse this, and there is a difference between a barrier and a guard, let's put it that way, especially as it relates to electrical. So we really kind of broke this down into electrical and non-electrical. It was commingled before, it was confusing, or had the potential to be confusing. So this slide is electrical only, and we try to make distinguishing differences between the two, and then we identify in this one the fact that we reference the MAD table here, and I'm not going to say much more than that because the next one then separates it out. The next slide separates it out into the non-electrical slide, which we did not have before. And so we felt that this topic with respect to barriers and guards just needed to have some more granularity brought to it as far as the differences between the two, electrical and non-electrical, and then to further define the difference between a barrier and a guard and how they applied in your work environment. So those were the primary changes to section 16 and 17. Any questions on those? Okay, so you all know, since there's about 80 of you online, that we talked about you at the break. And this is an opportunity, by the way, for you guys to ask questions. If you're not sure, please ask questions. If we don't have the answers to them, we'll get you the answers to them. But this is an opportunity to not just go through the document for you to take a look at it, but if you have questions or need clarification, things that you're working with maybe right now on a job site, and you want to make sure you're clear moving forward, go ahead and ask the question. We'll do our best to answer it, and we just want it to be clear for everybody. So with that little promo said, we will, as you can see, what Rachel shows you on this slide here is just the non-electrical side of barriers and guards. So any questions there? Okay. Next slide. Go ahead, Rachel. So what this slide, yep, there we go. Thank you. Just for everybody on the phone, really just changed it, electrical contact accident protocol, just to electrical contact protocol. The title had a little bit of redundancy in it. We deleted some of the contact information because that's really the responsibility of the contractor to provide to BPA in their safety plan submittal. We don't need to be telling you where you're going to take people. That's up to you to define as far as your safety plan protocol, where these people happen. Now, there's some common places that everyone goes to when you have an electrical accident, like Harborview Medical or things like that. But we really do want contractors to take this on. This is their responsibility to define in situations like this where personnel would be taken care of. And then we revised some of the language. It was a little out of process orientation, or just flow, if you will. And then how we get people back to work. We just added some clarifying language that we would ask you as a contractor to read through, make sure you understand before you put Jerry back to work, if you will, that you've stepped through, you've asked, you've looked at, you've identified the things that need to be identified with respect to the safety of the operation. And Nicole just posted something. Nicole, can you define what you just posted for everyone?
Sorry, I was just responding to a question that we got on the chat bar. They were looking for the updated C#, and I just pointed them to the external facing site.
Thank you for doing that. Okay, so folks, while we're talking again, ask questions. You can see we're kind of updating some information in the chat there, and I'll keep moving forward towards grounding grids. And Actually, I might not even talk about this. If Adam Ebert was on the phone, I would let him go for this one because this is near and dear to his heart. And we made some changes to this document. We moved it up in as far as a formatting or sequencing of the document. We moved it, made a few language changes. But Adam, what's the importance of this to you?
Well, specifically, this one went back to an area or a time a couple years ago when we started doing some testing, or at least revised some testing requirements on our ground grids that we were doing internally. And so we looked at our testing standards, came out with some new equipment, and went out and started using this testing methodology, and found out that there were a number of our switch yards that weren't as good as we would like them to be, for lack of a better word. So what we did is we issued some safety alerts, actually two. One, the initial, and then there was also an amendment to that, or a revision to that, where we, I'll start at the first one. The first one offered a solution of using gloves and or boots. I guess it was just or boots, to get the language correct, to mitigate the hazard that was being that was available on these gates that had the insufficient grounding grid. And after we sort of thought about it, I engaged the grounding committee about this, and we started talking about it. And there's a lot of smart people in that room, and we decided that rather than mitigate the hazard through a set of boots, meaning insulate from the ground up, we would just rather not expose the employee in series at all to this hazard. And that's why we went with the gloves only. And we understand that made things a little bit difficult in the field, and some people had already purchased some boots, but we really felt that it was the right direction to go as far as protecting someone from the hazard. So we issued an amendment or a revision to that safety hazard, and those signs are on the gates, or should be on the gates, that the hazard hasn't been repaired. There's a database that we're maintaining through the TE folks, and they have this work process running out for, I think, probably 2 years, for the next 2 years, to go out and repair all these sites that we have found with inadequate grounding grids. So quite a few sites have been repaired. Others are on the way. We're working on it, and in the meantime, it's gloves to protect yourself or to protect your employees on those specific sites, or at those specific sites.
Well, one of the questions that came up in the chat, Adam, I'll address this back to you, says, does this include the discharge of static charge buildup?
Static charge buildup. So if you were in a substation and that's kind of a difficult question to answer, but if you were wearing PPE, or you didn't get yourself in series with two potential differences, then that static charge would not be able to discharge. So we're handling this from this mitigation effort that we're doing is not trying to get in series, and that's the reason for the gloves. And then I've seen another one. Where can contractors obtain the current version of the APM, and also is the BPA fall protection? Okay, that's a different question, but hopefully the use of these gloves will mitigate that static charge or charge imposed on the gates, and then hopefully not through someone, by the use of the PPE, dielectric. So the idea is to keep yourself from getting in series with two different potentials.
So for questions like this, folks, we will also do a little back checking on these things. We don't want to be too off the cuff. I mean, if we know what we're talking about, we'll give you the answer like we just did here. But when we have some questions that you are asking that we're not 100% clear on, we still will go out and do some back checking, verifying of the information. As we talked about very early on in this discussion, we will post this, this meeting, if you will, the FAQs, the questions that were asked for everybody to see. With respects to how you get a hold of the APM, and we'll get to fall protection, so hold the backside of that question for later, Chad. But as far as the APM, Alan, can you address that?
Yeah, so the C-sharps, nowhere do we require the fall protection handbook regarding contracted work. I mean, we do have contractors who are embedded with BPA crews that are out of the scope of the C-sharps that may utilize that. But for the benefit of the contractors on this call, the fall protection handbook is not referenced by BPA contract documentation to those contractors. In regards to the APM, that is, I'm not sure exactly for those contractors that have that referenced. Basically, the C-sharps reference is the Rules of Conduct Handbook. Rules of Conduct Handbook for certain types of permit requirements do provide APMs for, do test contractors on the APM for some type of work. And we're going to have to get back to everyone where they get the APM. That's not clear to me for those contractors that need to have that.
Okay, very good. So, folks, we owe you on that one. Go ahead. If there are no other questions about the slide, let's go to the next one, which Adam's going to want to play in on too, because this is all about grounding. So, next slide, Rachel.
Do you see it yet?
Not yet. I'm waiting for it.
For those on the line, there's about a 30-second delay between updating to the next slide and it actually popping up is where the delay's coming from.
And while that updates, I want to circle back to Robin with her question of static charge buildup. Was that in? Can you elaborate on what you meant by that exactly?
Well, we'll look for it in the chat, but just to continue forward, stay hot here, because this grounding section went through a major rewrite. We placed a great deal more responsibility, again, on the contractors to identify and how they were going to mitigate those hazards. We talk about in this section portable protective grounding. We talk about the fact that a contractor would be responsible for the development of a grounding plan. Obviously, that is coordinated through us and with us. We talk about, again, in energized facilities, how those grounds would be addressed. We provided, again, information that is derived from our BPA work standard. We tell you as a contractor that it is available upon request. And let's see, what else did we do here, Adam? I mean, we really, and you're on the grounding committee, so everybody knows on the phone that Adam Eert comes to us. He works on our BPA grounding committee. And so, Adam, what else did we do to this section? Well, one of the things that was important to me when we did this is that, you know, one of the things folks were on the phone here is we talked about with new lines or equipment that have not previously been connected to the BPA power system. It wasn't in there before. We kind of gave you a step-by-step process of how this equipment would be commissioned, if you will, for lack of a better way to say that. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, and you know, we want to take every effort possible that we can to mitigate any transfer potential hazards. So, if you have a grounding plan, a grounding system in place that is adequate, then we would want to know what that is before, especially if you get off the ground mat. There's just things get awful complicated, and when you're tying two things together, you need a very substantial grounding system to deal with that. And I see Robin Smith. I was referring to the trip to the hospital for any shock. Often an insulated person will have a static voltage built up that must be discharged when preparing to touch grounded equipment. The preferred approach is a wrist grounding strap, but sometimes occurs making the first touch to grounded electric equipment racks after walking around a control house. Okay, now I know that there's a lot of work procedures involved in especially telecommunications work, where you want to have, especially dealing with that type of equipment and some SPC type work, where you're dealing with microcircuitry and you have grounding straps that you want to make sure you're connected to. Everybody's at the same potential there to make sure you don't discharge and cause any false operations. I assume that's what that is about.
I believe, Adam, that the question is related to the previous slide prior to that one, talking about the accident contact protocol. And the question is related to, do they invoke the contact accident protocol for static discharge? Or, that type of an incident.
Well, yeah, okay, so that's dealing with more of a nuisance shock, and I know that's a little bit ambiguous, but when you're dealing with microcircuit, or, all the stuff inside a control house, and you're talking about using grounding wrist straps and things like that, those are nuisance shocks that will usually not affect a person. We're not talking about grounding of equipment. If we're talking about shocks out on the right-of-way or in the substations that, where you actually have current flowing through your body, that's a whole different thing. So I see that the question's kind of getting a little bit, I hope, are we talking about in the yard or on a right-of-way when someone gets shocked, or are we talking about making someone the same potential with a wrist strap when they're working on microcircuitry? That's two different things there. And no, that doesn't apply.
Okay, so I know that Nicole and Rachel are also tracking this. These are some of those questions, folks, that we will follow up on and clarify. I appreciate, as you do ask the questions, if you can be specific. Yeah, like Adam was asking some more of those more interrogative type questions, to kind of get it better clarified so we can answer it properly. So I don't know if I said that right, but ask the questions in the chat specific to the work area or process that you want to have identified. We'll do the best we can to online answer it, and we are also kind of capturing all those, and we will get you a more definitive answer on the back side of this meeting. So with that, I'd appreciate that if you can continue to move that direction. Okay. Let's see. Any other questions with respects to this grounding? So if not, we've moved now to slide section 21, which is just the grounds, the portable, the static wire. We felt like in the old document that this again needed to kind of be unpackaged from the grounding section that it was buried in, if you will, and make it a standalone section, which we did now. We've provided some clarifying language. Again, you can see here on this slide that we reference a work standard. We also clarified and addressed the topic of what's considered human external cargo. Wasn't really clear in the other document with what we were trying to accomplish here with respects to grounds, portable, protective, and static wire. And then in this section, we went ahead and brought some greater clarity to that whole topic of step and touch potential. Felt like it wasn't there before, needed to be there now, so we made those types of changes. Any questions or comments on that? Adam, you have anything else you want to add? Okay, moving on. What we have on the slide right now has to do, again, we pulled the grounding of power and lift equipment, so power equipment, lifting equipment. We pulled that out of the grounding section, made it its own standalone section. We talk about and we discuss vehicle parking. energized high voltage equipment. We also discussed what you need to do with respect to your man lifts, cranes, other overhead equipment, or where you have overhead hazards or the potential to have contact with, or just induced current, if you will, I guess it would be. We also go through in this section, we talk about grounding mats for connected equipment. And like I said, we again provided information on the work standard that's associated with grounding work, equipment, and vehicles and substations. That work standard is available upon request. Adam, do you have anything? Alan, do you have anything you want to add there?
Not to that section, no.
No, and yeah, I was making sure I wasn't misquoting the standard to Robin in from the previous section. Sorry, but yeah, we do have that written, and I'll just say this: what for clarity for the group. Our electrical contact protocols, any worker experiencing electrical shock of any type will be transported to the nearest emergency medical facility as soon as possible. And then it goes on to further define that a little bit in 18.2, which is electrical contact is defined as any current flow through or across the employee's body, or if any of the following is true. And then it lists burns or wounds, interrupted or impaired breathing, the employee not able to let go of the circuit or equipment, any neurological problems, tremor, shaking, numbness, etc., and pain lasting greater than 5 minutes. Okay, so her question was leaning towards working on static voltage buildup when you're wearing a bonding strap and working on microcircuitry equipment. If you get a small little, like you rub your feet on the carpet and go zap zap to a rack that you're working on in the house, those are nuisance shocks. And I realize that discharge is actually current from, to the strictest sense. What we're talking about is something that would actually injure an employee. And that I don't think that would apply exactly.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Rachel, to the next slide. Again, as we did with grounding of power and lift equipment, the next slide talks about what you do with respects to under grounding, if you will, extension cords, tools, and metallic cables. You can see that on the screen. Again, it was buried within grounding. It needed to be pulled out, separated, and identified as a standalone. You can read the language that is in there, that section. And again, we add a reference to the BPA work standard that floats around this. And then we talk about the protecting against transfer potential hazards, things like that. So just a little bit of clarity. As you can tell with these last few sections, the old grounding section had many things in one box, if you will. And what this document did, this revision of C# did, was to unpack all those boxes, if you will, make sure that there was no misunderstanding with respect to what we were asking y'all to do. So that was the point of doing some of this separation. Go ahead to the next. Okay, so am I live now? Okay. So what we did here is under lightning work containment, really not any big significant changes. I just want to highlight the fact that while we identify what to do with respect to pulling off of a job site, we felt it was important to clarify in this document what to do to go back to work. And so that was really kind of put, if you will, you see that in the second paragraph there. The supervisor has a responsibility to assess the work environment. Once they deem it safe to go back to work, we know they can go back to work. That was really kind of the clarifier there. Any questions on that? Okay, minimum approach distances. So the first thing we did is we reformatted it. We pulled the MAD table that you're going to see here in the next slide right out of the APM. And what we did here is we kind of made sure that it had a little better look to it, had a better, it was kind of visually kind of hard to follow in the old document. The other thing we did is in this section, as you can see on this slide, is we talked about minimum approach distances with respect to inside the fence, and outside the fence as it relates to treating all conductors and equipment as energized. So we brought some clarity to those two topics. And then, we had the discussion about, and you have to think about this too on the phone. When you're doing any type of operations, vegetation management, for example, if I'm inside or working in around a substation, energized facility like that, how do you address those things with respects to overspray? Is it conductive? Does it have the potential to be conductive? I think I plant that in your mind just to, as we look at the minimum approach distances, look through those tables because it does talk about with respects to equipment and treated as energized unless the contractor has been informed by somebody, a BPA qualified clearance holder. You can read through all that. I'm not going to read your slide, but just did some clarifying language, provided some separation from inside to outside the fence. And then, like I said, go ahead to the next slide, Rachel. We brought a little more clarity to the tables themselves, which you're going to see in the next slide. Any question on this? One of the things I learned coming to the Bonneville Power Administration from, the Corps of Engineers to here was the fact that y'all play with elevations. Really never addressed approach distances in the Corps with respects to elevations, mostly because we're always on the river. But I found that this is a really interesting section to kind of go through and work through again. All we really did try to do with respects to is kind of do a format and an alignment check. And we basically took to the information, like this slide says, right out of the April 19, 2019 APM. Okay? Any questions on that? Rodney, you want to go ahead and float that out there? Go ahead, Rodney. Also, I would tell you that during the September time frame, we went back into Section 25. We did some clarifying. This was not in the earlier version of C#, but this last revision, the 21-2, we came back in this Section 25 and other areas within the C# document to address some of the follow-up actions associated with an accident that we had been investigating. Felt like we could provide additional clarity with respects to activities, things like that. So I don't know if, Rodney, you want to talk about that at all. If not, I'll just keep moving forward.
Sorry, I was double muted. No, just making sure to, identify that there's different permit levels that allow them to work at different MAD distances. And in some cases, you've moved forward to the safety watcher. They would require, they need a safety watcher / escort if they're not permitted for starters. And then in order to do anything within those distances listed for non-permitted persons, they would also need a safety watcher under those circumstances. So just to make sure that it was, it isn't always clear. And when we say, follow the MAD, if you choose not to permit those workers, they have to apply the MAD table in Table G.
Okay. Thanks, Rodney. Go ahead, Rachel, to the next slide because it segues into what Rodney is just talking about, which has everything to do with safety watchers. And folks, I would encourage everyone on this phone to, again, as we've been talking about reading the manual, you need to read this section with respects to safety watchers because there was a major rewrite to this section of the C# document. A totally reformatted, total content change, if you will. We provided a better definition of what is a safety watcher. We better defined their roles and responsibilities. We better defined the language associated with escort planning, how that is provided to us as part of your safety plan. And I know Rodney had been working with this internally, for the Bonneville Power Organization, but Also, we took some of that language, made sure it was transparent to contractors so they would see what their requirements were back to us. And so that's what the slide says that you can see there. Rodney, did you have anything you wanted to add there for Alan?
No, just, yeah, I think I would add here that, those contractors that have qualified electrical workers that meet the requirements in Chapter 2 that we're going to talk about later, and get a BPA electrical worker permit, that is one option for safety watching, in addition to what is available through the labor providers off of the safety watcher list that I maintain.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Rodney. Any other questions on safety watchers? So this is a heads up to Alan. I'm going to do the next two slides and then hand it back to you. There's the next slide with respects to environmental hazards. Again, just some minor language changes that point out that, again, it's the contractor's responsibility to monitor, to assess, and develop a plan, a safety plan. This is a part of your submittal that identifies your work environment, the hazards that are in those work environments, the risks associated with them, how you're going to control or mitigate those hazards. And much like an organization that's pretty old, you have to do your due diligence with respect to identification of asbestos, lead, mercury, things like that, environmental hazards. Think about it in a different way, and this has been a very interesting piece. It's not in the C# document, but you've had information pointed to you as contractors with providing the BPA with respects to COVID. And you've had to make that's not really an environmental hazard, but you've had to change your safety plan and your safety plan template to address that. So I don't want to commingle too many different things, but with respects to this section, recognize the fact that different plans have different requirements with respects to competent persons, qualified persons. You would be responsible then to provide to BPA the level of training or certification that goes along with those competent persons. That allows us as BPA to then verify, validate that we have the right person doing the right things at the job site. But again, asbestos, lead, mercury, silica are just a few of the things that we identify in the work environment. It's responsibility for the contractor to do their planning accordingly. Ask questions if you're not sure. Get drawings if you're unsure, and let's work through this to make sure that we don't get out there and have potential exposures in the workplace. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, I want to address this slide, and then I'm going to tell you that recently we changed this section of the document. So as you can see, it was kind of in several different locations. Equipment and rigging was in Chapter 1. It was in Chapter 2. It was several different locations, Chapter 5 even, I believe. And so we kind of brought it under. We went out and got a rope, and we kind of put a lasso around it, kind of brought it into one standalone section. And we go through here, and we talk about this is common. What you see on the screen here is basically what you would refer to as custom fabricated hooks. And we're really good at making things, and we're really good at welding things together for the purposes of lifting and hoisting and moving pieces of equipment around. And that's fine if you do that, but it just has to follow a certain process and a protocol. And you can see here on the screen that it's fabricated as designed by a registered professional engineer. You proof tested, if you will, to 125% of the working load limit. And so those are just some common things that were in the old document. We kind of clarified them in this document. And then in September, based again on an incident that had occurred within the Bonneville Power Administration, we made a section, we made some changes, provided better clarification to what critical lift planning is and what needs to be defined as far as a critical lift plan, things that are out of view of the operator, things that I'm using two or more pieces of equipment, lifts when I do not know the weight of the load. And we defined in Section 28.3, I think it is, what is a critical lift. We then ask you as a contractor to provide us with some critical lift planning techniques we created a critical lift plan. It's a form that actually I brought with me from the Army Corps of Engineers about critical lift planning to make you kind of force you to do the math, kind of force you to look at the qualifications of the operator, the rigger, the signal person, to make you sure that we're doing things like checking the ground. Is it strong enough to substantiate the load that I'm about to place on it with just my crane, let alone do the work that I'm about to do. So one of the things that you would see on that forward-facing page to contractors is kind of this template for critical lift plans. And so that's all out there now. We would encourage you to take a look at that. But again, that was kind of a change that we made in the September timeframe. Any questions or comments on that?
Hey, Jerry, this is Ryan.
Go ahead, Ryan.
We had a situation down in Eugene. I had to do a walkthrough with an OSHA inspector, and he had identified a couple end wrenches that had been heated up and bent for a specific use. And he pointed out that you can't have custom fabricated tools that, weren't manufactured in that. They weren't manufactured that way. So we basically had to get rid of them. So just a little story for custom fabrication.
Yeah, I went down to the New Orleans district and looked at, I walked into the door on a Monday and this commander from the New Orleans district said, "You will not find any custom fabricated tools and or lifting equipment in my district." It took me 10 minutes to find somebody who had taken a wrench and heated it up and bent it 90 to get it into a specific location. And after the day one, I outbriefed him. He goes, "You didn't find anything, did you?" I went, "Oh, no, actually, I found about 30 pieces of it. You want to come out to the boneyard with me? I'll show you what I found on day one." So, yeah, I mean, if the manufacturer built it for a specific purpose, then we don't get to modify it for our purposes unless you do these things that are there. But again, great point by Ryan. The manufacturer tells you what you can and cannot do with these pieces of equipment, load handling equipment specifically here, and that's what we need to follow. And any questions on that? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Alan and go for it.
Sounds good. Next slide there, Rachel. This is related to spill kits. We've inserted a requirement for you to provide training on spill response based on the hazard, types of materials used and stored on site. So for construction activities, you need to have spill kits readily available, stocked and sized appropriately, and ensure your people are trained to utilize those. Any questions on that? Not, Rachel, would you go to the next slide? And we're getting into fall protection. So Section 30, we've expanded this and structured the language in a more cohesive manner, make it easier to be followed. Better definition of work over water. During work activities above 4 feet that require fall protection PPE, contractors need at least 2 qualified workers at the work site for rescue purposes. You need to have contacted first responder agencies to ensure that qualified personnel and necessary equipment is available to respond if you're using first responder agencies for your rescue efforts. If local first responder agencies are able to provide adequate fall protection rescue personnel and equipment, you need to have a formal and site-specific fall protection rescue plan as part of your submission to the to your safety plan. So in essence, if you got people working over 4 feet, you need to let us BPA know in your safety plan how you're going to address that fall protection rescue. Contractors performing work at a height of 10 feet or greater need to have a written site-specific fall protection rescue work plan reviewed by the safety or BPA safety as part of your safety plan submittal prior to commencement of work. Any questions there? That, Rachel, if you want to go to the next slide. So in the fiber optics, no significant changes to this section. The use of personal protective equipment is required to prevent injury, eye protection when splicing glass fiber. You need to take care during the cleaving process to protect the eyes and body from those broken glass pieces. If chemicals that are present in the fiber or the chemical used to clean fiber may contain the use the chemicals may require the use of hand protection. Definitely take a look at the safety data sheets for the proper use of personal protective equipment. And then we have a BPA work standard that for fiber optics, and that's available upon request to your COR. Next slide, if there's no questions. Fire hazards. In section 32, we made some minor content changes. We added portable fire extinguisher requirements, pulling language from other sections of the old C-Sharps document to consolidate it here for making the document a little bit easier to utilize. You're responsible for contacting the local jurisdiction having authority and being aware of and complying with any fire restrictions, shutdowns, or other special requirements. The contract, you're responsible for carrying fire suppression equipment and tools as required by the authority having jurisdiction and training workers in their use. One of the things we often see as one of the main hazards on our sites is, especially in the recent fire season, often when we're looking at a safety plan, we're looking to see whether you've got a process for monitoring fire hazards for those crews you might have working in proximity or out there in the field where there is that high fire danger. Let me see if there's any questions. No, would you go to the next slide there, Rachel? This next section, section 33, we're dealing with hazard communications. We've made some minor language and paragraph structure modifications. We've added emergency response information requirements, contractors to list the approximation of quantities of materials on site, site map, inventory requirements. So in essence, you're required to maintain any safety data sheets at the work location for the materials that you have on site that you'll be procuring, storing, or using at the project. And we're looking for, attached to your safety plan, inventory showing and identifying where inventoried substances are stored. Any questions there? Next slide. Robin Smith provided a comment. Some fiber optic transmitters can emit enough light levels to damage the eye and not be visible to the eye. Warning signs of protective eye are usually specified as never electing
as well.
Yeah, as well. The end of as well as never looking at the end of a fiber strand with the naked eye. That's a good reminder. Let's see where we're at. Job briefing. So we made some, section 34, we made some moderate revisions to contact within the site. We've added some requirements for job briefings to ensure that you discuss workplace hazards, how risks will be mitigated or controlled and noted on the safety plan. So we require you to conduct a documented job briefing each morning, with safety is an important part of that. Have a written daily job briefing, and the notes at the minimum should show the date, time, topics discovered, attendees of the meeting, and retained during the duration of the warranty of that particular project. Any questions on that? If not,
well, I would tell you that I use this. I really do, folks. I don't know if you understand how important it is, but for those of us who go out and do job observations and things like that, this is a way for us to immediately kind of look at what's going on in the work environment as far as what are you addressing in your daily job briefings. I mean, if we're getting together and having coffee and talking about the fact the Seahawks won in the last minute of the game the other night, that's fine. But we also need to be paying attention to the hazards that we encounter every day. It's so easy sometimes to kind of just lose focus. I'm on a roll. I've got things moving. I'm just doing really well. But we need to make sure that we document these job safety briefings. I will tell you, having done a few accident investigations in my career, one of the things I go back and look at is this job briefing. What are we talking about on a daily basis as a crew? Are we identifying the work that is right in front of us? Are we looking at strategic planning? What do we got coming into view around, maybe in the next few days? These are critical pieces of equipment. Do not forsake the importance of these job briefings. They are a great indicator, at least to us, as to kind of what's going on in your work environment. What are you focused on? What are you planning for? What are you addressing that's being brought up by the crews? So very important piece. I mean, we kind of go over it and we talk about the importance of it, but I really want to underline these are valuable documents.
really good points, Sherry. Next slide, Rachel. Now we're getting to lockout tagout. There were some minor changes to the section. We expounded on the requirements for the development of a lockout tagout program in accordance with OSHA regulations and ANSI standards. We're looking for in your safety plan is what's your plan for how are you going to coordinate with other BPA employees, other contract workers that might be working on adjacent or similar equipment, and that coordination piece that's really important. Any questions on that section? Let's go to the next slide. Medical services and first aid. So in Section 36, we provided more structure and language associated with the contract, with your requirements to ensure compliance with the OSHA regulations. We changed how the contractor and BPA will assess the job, determine if an AED was required on the job. What we're looking for you to do in your safety plan is tell us or demonstrate to us that you've done that for that project, you've done your assessments required by OSHA, determine what are the hazards and how you're going to mitigate them regarding medical services and first aid. We've cleaned up some of the language associated with training of first aid, CPRs, AEDs, and we've added an inspection requirement for first aid kits, ensuring that you're maintaining them up to date as required by OSHA. Workers required to use an AED should be trained in the proper use and functionality of the AED. All classes to contain a hand-on component and cannot be taken online, of course. Training will be on the same model and manufacture of the AED that you're deploying for your workers. If you've done that assessment and determined that an AED is required on the job. And then the certificates will state the date of issue and length and of validity that worker CPR AED class certification that they have on that. Any questions on that?
I want to remind all the contractors that back in the March timeframe when COVID was at its peak, that organizations like the American Heart Association, Red Cross, like that, they understood that for a period of time we weren't going to actually, as Alan pointed out, be able to get in the office, put my hands on some of this equipment to be recertified, things like that. I want to make sure that you were all tracking the fact that for a period of time, those agencies like American Heart, Red Cross kind of had a deferment program by which, if you were coming up due in that March, April, May, June timeframe, that there was a letter that went out that identified how the process would work moving forward. We're beyond all those dates now, And so I'm going to assume that everybody who's out in the listing world is a contractor working for BPA, that they've adequately and properly addressed the recertification of their employees.
That's a good add, Jerry. Next slide, Rachel. So we're getting into Section 37, personal protective equipment. There are no significant, we made some minor formatting and content changes, no significant changes to the section. Essentially, what we require is a Class 75 protective footwear with an EH rating, meeting that ASTM F2413 standard. We require that footwear in all areas where hard hats are required and other work areas determined by a supervisor. So on your work site, you need to determine where that's required and ensure that your employees are wearing the appropriate footwear for the job. If there's no questions, we'll move on to the next slide.
I bet Rachel stops us.
So in this section, Section 38, radio frequency exposure for personal communication systems. Again, no significant changes. We've added a reference to a BPA work standard for communication antennas, RF exposure, to give more context in reference to our procedure document. BPA structures at communication sites as radio stations, substations, may have antennas that may be energized without notice. Some of those structures have antennas that BPA doesn't have control over. A personal RF monitor will be worn at all times at those sites are working on a structure. Personnel should not assume the areas without RF exposure. If the work exceeds the maximum permissible exposure, land mobile radios, PSCS, wireless equipment should be de-energized and tagged consistent with the contractor's lockout tagout procedures, so it cannot be energized while the work is in progress. The 5-foot rule stated here is based on system-wide average for most PCS cellular, high-frequency VHF, UHF, 700 megahertz and 800 megahertz antennas on BPA communication structures. By communication structures, we mean transmission towers, communication towers, buildings, and poles. The minimum safe working distance for these antennas may be greater than or less than 5 feet. Any antenna requires a minimum safe working distance. Any questions on this particular section? That was a complex set of statements I made, so I want to make sure that no one has any questions on that section. Okay. Rachel, if you could go to the next one.
Actually, Alan, we're about to take another 10-minute break. Let's be back at 11:10. Thank you.
Okay.
Just waiting for my meeting to start in a minute again.
Well, join ours. It's more fun.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's get started on section 39.
Okay, I'll take it from here, Alan, for a little bit. And with everything that's in me, it's really hard not to, given my disposition and personality, to say, of course, I get to start out on a crappy slide. But I won't say that. I will tell you that the toilet facilities, one of the only thing that we did, that we added to the section was in light of recent events in the world, really. When it's practical, when it's not practical to provide running water, we talk about making sure that we have a hand sanitizer substitute. We define what that hand sanitizer substitute needs to be, and I lost my slides. And so that's really all there was in section 39 with respects to hand sanitizer. So Rachel, I don't know where the slides are, but I'm moving to section number 40, which talks about traffic control. Folks, it was in the old document. It's still there. We made really no significant changes. All we did is we made sure that contractors followed the basic, the MUTCD, which is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. We make sure that the contractor identifies in their safety plan to this how they will address traffic control. We talk about the need for, as far as personal protective equipment goes, high visibility vests that meet the NCI SEA standards, and that all flaggers will have in their possession appropriate state certification attesting to the training that they've completed. So really, folks, just some of the basics. Just make sure that we have qualified, competent people doing the flagging, that they've been trained, that they're wearing the proper personal protective equipment, and that as a part of your plan, you will tell us how you're going to manage traffic flow control on your work site. So, any questions there? If not, we'll go to transition.
Hey, Jerry,
information.
This is Rachel. Just a reminder, we have 30 slides left, and we have about 45 to 50 minutes left on this presentation. So we might pick up the pace a little.
So, great point to everybody. And even though I'm from a small town in north central Washington, one of the things I did see that we have 31 slides, and like Rachel just identified. So one of the things I did this morning is to talk to the folks that run the conference center on WebEx. And WebEx will not shut off if we hit 12 o'clock, high noon, if you will. It won't shut off until we shut it off. And so, folks, if we're not done yet, it's really important to kind of get through this. So if it does run over noon, just know that you're not going to get dropped off. We continue to move forward at maybe a little quicker pace, but we still have time on our side after noon if we need it. So trenching and excavation talks about, again, no significant changes. We just made sure that the contractors recognized that they needed to provide and prepare and provide to us a trenching plan and excavation plan, that's done by a competent person or a registered professional engineer, and that gets submitted as part of your safety plan package. Any questions on that? Okay, so welding, there was no significant changes to this section. Just some clarification, some cleaning up of the language with respect to the welder notifying other personnel on their job site of what work is in their area, making sure that there is no potential for, people looking into an arc or a weld process, and to make sure that we've identified our clearance boundaries, things like that. So nothing really significant as far as changes go to welding. Any comments on that? Okay, now we get into very specific work in substations related BPA facilities. This is Chapter 2, and we did have, and so Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 is an overarching view. We made some major changes to the language that's in Chapter 2. Really what we did is we wanted to move and make sure that contractors understood that it was their responsibility provide us with qualified electrical personnel. And so much of the language that you'll see in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 does just that. It puts that onus, it puts that responsibility back onto contractor to ensure that they provide the Bonneville Power Administration with qualified, capable, competent persons to work on the job site. We had our standard language in there which talked about the fact that they would have to show us in the past 2 years grounding and bonding training. We talked in the past that they're now about having current first aid, CPR, current cards, things like that. And, so again, we really just changed the language on this section to put the emphasis and the responsibility of the contractor to provide us with qualified personnel. Any comments on that?
Yeah, Jerry, this is Rodney.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize on that section lists everything that is required for a qualified electrical worker, and that matches up with OSHA 1910-269 as well. But I want to kind of drive home that contractors that have somebody apply for, take the test, and pass the BPA electrical worker permit test, that shouldn't be what you're using to determine if somebody meets the qualifications. The qualifications are separate from that test, and I just wanted to emphasize that.
Okay, thank you. All right, Rachel, if you can go to the next slide, unless there's any other comments that I'm missing. Okay. So really, we just, again, some clarification, both on the requirement side of what we call this section. Excuse me here for a second. But we go through and we had a major rewrite to the section with respect to, we clarified again the contractor's responsibility. We talk about in this section about when clearances are not required. We talk about in this section about knowing the limits of the clearance, the facilities included, the status of grounding switches. We talk about the clearance holder will also know the clearance number, the date, time of issuance, that they would know the type of work that they're being, that's within the clearance. Clearance is issued on the same line or equipment. We review the contractor's grounding plan. That's something that contractors will provide to us in the safety plan. We want to see that grounding plan, as we've talked about before. We go through and we discuss the installation of barriers and guards as needed to prevent accidental contact with adjacent energized facilities. And, really I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that in this section we had probably new language in there with respect to when clearances are not required. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read that all to you. Suffice it to say, please go through and look at when clearances are not required under this section 2 of chapter 2 in this. We also, again, point to the fact that there is a BPA work standard, which is the title of it is Work on Equipment Separated from the Power System. Again, that is available upon request. Any comments or questions? Okay, Rachel, if you would, please. This section is, Jerry's got a cough. Again, with this section here, another major rewrite. We talk about the fact that we felt that there was just a need with respect to grounding grids and substations. It was buried, it was unclear to the point where we felt we needed to kind of separate this to address the requirements specifically to the grounding grid. We provide you references to both the work standard 1-5 and 1-15, which is the precautions to take when contracting in substation ground grid or when excavating, and then 1-15, which is groundwork equipment and vehicles in substations. So again, bottom line is we rewrote this section, we kind of cleaned it up a little bit. We provided some work standards that we felt were both applicable and relevant to work that was going on, and that the contractor would have availability to those upon request. Questions or comments? Okay. Pretty simple. We looked at this and didn't do much but a little housekeeping, house cleaning. There were no significant changes to switches and isolating devices. Again, we kind of point you to following and understanding what the MAD is saying with respect to minimum approach distances, but no significant changes to this section of the document. Next slide. Again, no significant changes to this section. All we did is a little housekeeping, house cleaning with respect to the workflow related to the processes and the purposes of doing this. Again, as you can see on the slide, we point to the work standard 9-7, which is bushing and potential devices, coupling caps in line, and that's available upon request. Okay. Current transformers. Other than doing a little cleaning up, there were no significant changes to this section of the manual document, I should say. Go ahead, Rachel. So there we go. Chapter 3. As with Chapter 2, as I noted earlier, we had a major rewrite to this section of the C-Sharps document. Really, we revised the definition of what was a qualified electrical line worker with the intent of ensuring that it was the contractor's responsibility to provide a qualified electrical line worker. We looked at the language. We felt that it was very prescriptive in the fact, if you remember the old one, it had something to the tune of you had to have 9,600 hours of this and 400 hours of that. And we pulled those number of hours out of there. And again, as I said earlier, we placed the responsibility, it's a contractor responsibility to ensure they are providing us with qualified electrical line workers. So the other significant changes is, again, along the lines of, they are certified to hold a BPA work clearance. They will have demonstrated a work history of successfully working under at least 3 clearances on a BPA or equivalent power system. They will have completed in the past 2 years grounding and bonding training. Again, we just put the onus and responsibility back onto the contractor to provide us with qualified electrical line workers. Any questions or comments on that? Again, much in the same way, just some minor rewriting. We did some formatting changes. We provide greater definition of the minimum crew size for installing personal protective grounds, which consists of, so you know, 2 qualified electrical line workers or 1 qualified electrical line worker and an electrical worker. And we kind of go through and we kind of clean up that document, and we talk about when applying personal protective grounds on transmission lines, the required electrical worker will be in the structure and or aerial lift device and be assisted by adequate help, crew on the ground. And that's really kind of just the major changes, if there were any. There was just some cleaning up of the language that I just defined. And then it was talked about, I think we defined even the crew, which is a group of workers performing a task at the same work location. The work location is defined as a specific tower or conductor span between towers. So just a little bit of clarifying of the language, nothing major there. Questions or comments? So, again, we did some major rewriting to this section, and this is where we have value in the folks like Ryan Brady and Adam Ewert and Adam Mapelski on our side of the house, because we really needed to go through and look at, the grounding section to make sure this was in alignment. We felt like we had some misplacement of some critical information, so we created a newer section here with this language. And really some of the things that we did was just talked about the return to construction status. We talked about reconductoring of existing lines, removal or replacement of facilities, and other similar type work. We talk about when a clearance is not required for this work, providing a letter requesting that the work to be accomplished without a clearance has been submitted and approved to us and through you folks. We talked about, I should let Adam talk about this. We talked about the fact that contractor will not perform any work on energized BPA high voltage conductors or equipment, and will not come within the MAD of energized lines or equipment specified in the tables that we've talked about earlier. We talked about de-energized conductors and equipment, which are to be grounded. They will first be tested for voltage using approved methods. Again, if you kind of tear this apart, you can see that in the older document, while we may have identified that there was a task to perform, we really weren't clear on what our intent and our purpose was with respect to the language we were using. So this section was revised to kind of break that down a little bit more, make it more understandable with respect to intent and purpose. And I think that's what we achieved here. Adam, I don't know if you have anything you want to add here, because we really did go through this section. Did I lose Adam? Alan, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Jerry.
I think with that in mind, I'm going to stop talking and give you slide number 60, and we'll go from there.
Sounds like a plan, Jerry. So slide number 60, continuing on with BPA right-of-way and towers. Let me make sure I'm on the right. Old C-sharps had this activity as part of the grounding section. We felt that they needed to be reorganized a little differently, and we created a new section, clarification of work on normally energized BPA transmission line, and related to clearance card holder language. There was a minor change on that. We put some formatting and structure changes. Essentially, a contractor should only perform work or will only perform work on normally energized BPA transmission lines under protection of a work clearance. However, a contractor may request as an extra layer of protection a hold order for work from proximity to energized lines and equipment when there's no intent or expectation the MAD will be violated. In regards to the contractor clearance holder, all work carried out by a contractor under a work clearance or hold order held by the contract worker will be governed by the transmission line maintenance standard that's referenced in the document. Contract clearance, hold order, and work permit procedure and BPA clearances on line sections. The BPA dispatcher will have full authority to deny issue of a clearance or hold order to any contract worker who, in the dispatcher's opinion, has not adequately met or performed all the requirements contained in those documents. You accept full responsibility for the failure of your clearance holder to faithfully and accurately perform all the requirements stated therein, or if the clearance holder is removed for cause under provisions of the C-sharps document. Multiple clearance holders may be required on the same project, depending on the situation. This is determined by BPA, and we'll look at that on a case-by-case basis. Your workers should be familiar with, know, and understand their responsibilities when working under a clearance or hold order in accordance with the contractor clearance, hold order, and work permit procedure. Any questions on that? Okay, we'll go to the next slide. The old section was hand lines and rope use and energized conductors, and the new hand lines and rope use and energized corridors. I meant quarters. The old C-sharps had this activity as part of the grounding section. We moved it here. No significant changes to the language. If there's no questions, we can go to the next slide, Rachel. In section 6 of BPA work on energized right-of-way and towers, old C-sharps had this activity as part of the grounding section. To be more clear and useful, we moved it here in its own section. No significant changes to the work under the old C-sharps document. Led in this section. We included a reference to the MAD tables in this section. Any questions on this one? Counterpoints. Old C-sharps had this activity as part of the grounding section. We moved it here separately. No significant changes. Consolidates comments that were identified in Chapter 1, Section 1.8 from our team. Essentially, thought we should break that out of that section in its own section just to be more clear here. Any questions? If not, we can go to the next slide, Rachel. Rachel, next slide.
Do you see the slide 64 yet?
No, but I'll continue. Section 8, stringing or removing conductor. No significant changes to this section either. We've the old C-sharps again had this activity as part of the grounding section. We moved this here within this section for more clarity to be usable. There's minor editorial changes that we made, ensuring a job briefing prior to stringing operations, all pulling and tensioning equipment to be isolated, insulated, and effectively grounded. Any questions on this particular section? And if not, Rachel, you can go on to the next slide. Commercial aviation services. We've made some minor changes to this section. Some of the formatting changes. We did a rewrite of 1.5 external load work and the requirement for the contract to submit those plans within 10 business days advance of any proposed flight operations. Excuse me. That was the major change that we made on this. Contractor has the sole responsibility for airworthiness, operation, safety of the aircraft, and the public as well. And this here also covers work utilizing a drone. Any questions there? And we can go to the next slide, Rachel. Next slide is again, commercial aviation, non-transportation, minor changes, no significant changes. Excuse me. Airplane or aircraft supporting BPA construction and maintenance activities may be used for any of the following: surveys, light detection, ranging, LiDAR, aerial photography. Personnel transported during these operations must be essential or directly associated with the aircraft operation. That's a requirement. You can start on to the next slide, Rachel. If there's any questions, please post them. I'll keep an eye on those. Helicopter services. No significant changes to this section. Excuse me. Aircraft vendors performing work under this contract must be certified under federal aviation regulations that are referenced. No significant changes. We can go to the next slide, Rachel. If there's no questions, I'll keep looking and seeing if there's any questions in the text. Again, no significant changes to this section. Helicopters supporting it may be used for, again, aerial photography, aerial surveys, LiDAR gathering, personnel being transported, again, must be essential to or directly associated with the aircraft operation. Rachel, you can start going to the next slide, and I'm going to look to see if there's any questions that pop up. Great. Commercial aviation services, non-transportation, construction, use of helicopter services in regarding construction repair, external load work, no significant changes. Your helicopters can be used for rotorcraft load combination, including Class A, B, or C loads. And again, personnel being transported must be essential to or directly associated with the aircraft and construction activities. You can start going to the next slide, Rachel. And I'm looking and checking, make sure we don't have any questions or comments. Pausing for a moment there. Next slide, regarding HELISAR operations, no significant changes. We do allow HELISAR operations. Again, the prohibition for the personnel being transported must be essential to or directly associated with the aircraft operation. All rotorcraft external load operations must use an FAA, a Federal Aviation Administration approved load attachment means, and the load carrying devices must meet industry standards. Go to the next slide, Rachel. And I think this is, you want to start from here, Jerry?
Yeah, and because it's so apropos, I'll land this plane. We have about 10 more slides. And so one of the things we did in this slide here is no significant changes, but you'll find in our organization, and I had to learn this the hard way, is that we are really good at acronyms. And so this whole title was nothing but acronyms in the earlier version of C#. So if we did nothing else, we demystified what SUAS stood for. And if you work in this environment, you probably know what that was. I did not. So we kind of cleaned this up. We kind of put in some different notification timelines. As you can see there, at least 24 hours prior to flight operations, if I could learn how to spell flight. But anyway, just some minor changes to the language within the section in and of itself. Nothing major. Go ahead, Rachel. All right. So this is the last chapter of the C# document. Everything to do with vegetation management. Again, no significant changes, but we moved the section 5.1 as part of the normal applies to everyone requirement for providing us with a job hazard analysis. That's universal for everything we do. I mean, you should be doing that as a contractor, even as a government employee. You should always be doing and looking at those job hazard analysis. So really the only tweak that we made to this section was just moving that requirement up to the universal requirements. And as you can see on this slide here, we reemphasize again the need for job briefings, and it talks about the contractor will maintain written documentation of those. We provide you with the BPA form that we're asking you to use. Next slide, please. Really, again, we talk about just some minor cleanup, but no significant changes to this section. We point them back very clearly to the MAD, and then we talk about the work being performed by qualified line clearance tree trimmers. Next slide, Rachel. Really did kind of go through this section to ensure consistency throughout the body of the document. So we kind of looked at the areas, including but not limited to climbing structures, climbing any areas within the MAD, Zone B specifically, when qualified worker is climbing greater than 12 feet in height. We added some language in here with respect to when sagging from a structure by transit or other. We discussed communication requirements and just some strategic, if you will, cleaning up of this section with respect to crew sizing and some of the specific work related to work within different zones and activities. Okay, next slide. Tree falling, just again, a little bit of rewrite to this section that addressed, again, climbing, working from certain pieces of aerial equipment. We talk about in here, I'm going to get on the right slide, but not really anything major, significant changes here, just some cleanup of the language. Go ahead, Rachel. We talked about in here the storage and handling and use of flammable liquids, make sure that was clear. We added some making sure contractors identified their ignition sources. what things are being handled, what things are being stored, making sure that the personnel doing all that was properly trained and had knowledge of what they were doing and where materials were being handled and stored. So really just some cleanup, not anything significant. Next slide. Again, no significant changes to the communication sections. We just made sure that the contractor will ensure that the field supervisor maintains communications. We talked about communications earlier in this briefing with the BPA clearance holder. Really no other significant changes there. Next slide. So again, no significant changes. Contractor will not perform any work on energized BPA high voltage conductors or equipment. Will not come in within the MAD. Things that we talked about earlier as far as pointing folks to Chapter 1, Section 25, which gives you the tables to work off of. No other significant changes there. And I think that goes without saying. So Attachment 1, I really appreciated this document. It's a job hazard analysis that is provided to you to use. It's there. You don't have to create the wheel. It's been given to you. And I thought it was a really well done document. We didn't make any changes to it. It's a standalone, self-sufficient document that works, so don't mess with it. So, with about 19 minutes to spare, go to the next slide, please. Okay, well, the last slide is basically just a summary slide. And in summary, at least from my perspective, we've had some 80-some people on this call, and I would tell you that we've done this now twice in BPA. We've provided the C# training. If you add up everybody that has been online for these 2 sessions, you'd quickly reach about 275 people. That's a big deal, folks. It's that you taking the time to, cancel out 3 hours of your morning and go through a document that can be as boring as heck, but is critical to the safety and health of our operations on a day-to-day basis. So I guess I would have 2 words for everyone that's been on this phone call, and those would be thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for asking questions. Those that we did not answer fully, we will knock those out. We will get the right answer for you. We will post that so it's available to you. But again, I think my last note would be to take a look at this document, pull it apart, read it, make sure that you are clear if you are a contractor working for us. If you are not clear, ask the question. We have people that are there to help you. Of course, safety is always there to help our contracting officers in whatever support they need. But this is a critical document to ensure the success of our operations. And much of that is done with your hands and with your legs. So thank you for all the work that you do for us. Thank you for looking at this document. And I think with that, I'm going to shut up and hand it over to Adam for his closing comments.
Yeah, I'd just like to, one of the main topics that we talked about here, we had questions come back, was related to that electrical accident protocol. And as we're going through the other slides, I realized that I failed to give the why we have that in our documents. And that is that BPA's experienced, unfortunately, in our history, some electrical contact incidents. One of which an employee had an electrical contact, no entry-exit rooms really, was fine, continued work that day. Over time, they wound up with neurological damage, and that progressively worsened to the point where they could no longer work in that field ever again. And part of the lessons learned that BPA had was that not every hospital understands the effects of a body from an electrical contact incident at the kind of voltages that apply on our BPA system, and that burn centers do recognize those bodies, and oftentimes hospitals won't automatically realize and reference a person to a burn center because these type of injuries with these kind of voltage are so infrequent. So BPA set up that electrical protocol to ensure that if any of our internal workers receive an electrical shock at that kind of voltage, that we ensure that the right type of medical expert with the right type of expertise to provide that type of initial treatment to the employee can affect that progression. And so for that reason is the reason why we have that electrical contact protocol, the reason why we make that so clear and reinforce that in our safety plan documentation. And with that, I don't have any further comments. Rachel, if you want to conclude, I think we're done.
Thanks, Alan. Robert Brooks asked the question, can we get a video copy of this? I will check with our IT and security group to see if we're authorized to upload it, and if we get that approval, we'll be uploading it to that contractor safety subpage where all the other items are. Yeah, if you have any other questions, please reach out to your CO or COR, and we'll get this video hopefully uploaded, and as well as any questions that we still need to answer uploaded to that page as soon as possible. Oh, and just a reminder that we want contractors to conform with the new C-sharps by November 1st. So now's the time to reach out and ask questions if you have any questions about the updates. And that's it. Thank you, everyone, for attending.